Chairman Boxer and Ranking Member Vitter, thank you so much for holding the hearing today. And I want to welcome Administrator McCarthy. It is always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for being here today. We all share in the goal of cleaner air and can be proud of the tremendous improvements we have made in air quality over the past several decades. Air pollution has decreased even as our population and the number of vehicles on the roads have increased, and even as our economy has grown. In Nebraska, our public power utilities have made significant investments in coal-generated facilities in order to provide an even cleaner source of that low-cost energy in our state. While the regulatory actions at issue today are being pursued under the authority of the Clean Air Act, they are a significant departure from the true aims of the statute. In an unprecedented use of the law, this administration is seeking to reduce U.S. emissions of carbon dioxide, ostensibly to control global temperature changes. While the environmental benefits of capping carbon in America are negligible at best, the economic consequences are unquestionably devastating. President Obama himself warned that electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket under a plan to control carbon. More than 80% of America's energy needs are met through carbon-emitting conventional fuels. Last year, coal and natural gas provided 66% of U.S. electricity generation. As EPA forces carbon reduction, it inflicts higher energy costs on American families and on businesses. While the economic pain would be felt throughout the country, it is America's poorest families that will be hit the hardest. The median family spends about 5 cents out of every dollar on energy costs. Low-income families spend about 20 cents. States like Nebraska that receive a majority of their electricity from coal-fired generation would also be disproportionately harmed under this proposal. The guidelines would force the premature retirement of efficient, low-cost, coal-fueled generation, lead to the potential loss of billions of dollars in investments made over the last decade to make coal plants cleaner, and require construction of higher-cost replacement generation, and would increase natural gas prices. Also troubling is the EPA set emission guidelines that are not achievable at the affected source, the electricity generating unit. Energy efficiency and renewable portfolio mandates should not come through regulatory fiat. While I do not have enough time to list all the concerns raised by this proposal, you know that I believe there are many. The issues are complex and the impacts are far-reaching. While I appreciate the 120-day comment period that was granted for public comment on this rule, the challenge presented to the states and other stakeholders to analyze and assess the enormous range of issues that are posed is beyond expectations. The level of complexity of the proposal, the volume of technical documents that are released, the amount of coordination required, and the magnitude of energy impacts of the rule, I believe, warrant a 60-day extension of that public comment period. I hope to visit with you about that. I am pleased that we are spending time today examining some of the concerns raised by the proposal. This is an important discussion. This is an important debate, and I look forward to today's dialogue. Thank you. Thank you again, Madam Chair, and thank you, Administrator, for being here.
You too.
These are very complicated issues, and I'd like to bring the focus back to those issues. I have a question that is a bit long. It's in the weeds. I hope you'll bear with me on it. I'm going to read it to you so I get all the facts in here correct as I pose it to you. In Building Block 2, the EPA assumes that gas plants will run far more in order to run coal-fired plants far less. This will reduce the heat rate efficiency of coal-fired plants, as running any plant less and on an intermittent basis always reduces efficiency. To offer an analogy, I think this is the equivalent of operating a car in city driving where it's stop and go, which reduces the efficiency in the form of miles per gallon as compared to when you're on a constant rate on highway driving. What this means is that building block 2, which calls for running coal-fired plants less, is directly at odds with the goals of building block 1, which calls for improving the heat rate of coal-fired plants. So building blocks 1 and 2 are in direct opposition with each other. You can't run both coal plants less while running gas plants more, and then turn around and argue that the heat rate of coal plants should be improved. So did the EPA consider that the amount of switching to natural gas effectively required by this rule would require coal power plants to operate less, thus driving up heat rates substantially? And I think that would just obliterate any heat rate improvement that we would see at these coal units.
Well, let me give a little bit of an explanation, and I don't want to take too much of your time. But the building blocks were really opportunities, practical, affordable opportunities to reduce carbon emissions that went into the setting of the state standards. None of them are requirements. They are not requirements. States can actually achieve and comply with those standards in any way they design. So if states are heavily invested in renewables and they need NGCC or peaking units done in a way that's much more intermittent than the 70% capacity rate, they can just simply not do that. None of these are requirements. You need to do none of them. But they actually were our analysis of what we thought were practical and affordable steps that could be taken to get the system more efficient and to shift to cleaner sources. And so states can use whatever creative approach they want to use as long as they're getting at the reductions in those fossil fuel plants that are required.
You know, you've talked a lot about flexibility
yes.
here, the flexibility for the states, but I think that that flexible solution, in effect, is going to shut down coal plants, because if you're going to avoid that conflict between that bucket 1 and bucket 2, it's going to call for heat improvements for the coal plants with bucket 1, but under bucket 2, you're going to run it less. So how does that make it more flexible? I think the conflict there is just going to mean the retirement of these coal plants.
Let me give you an example. I know that the state of West Virginia was mentioned. If you look at the state standard for West Virginia, the state standard is not enormously aggressive. In fact, many have questioned why it isn't more aggressive. But what it says is that, yeah, I know, and neither am I. I mean, we'll take comment, but we actually looked at the fact that they're heavily dependent on coal, and their answer may very well be to invest in that coal to make it more efficient moving forward. In fact, if you look at our analysis, it shows that coal today, in 2012, actually generated about 37% of the electricity. What we're projecting is in 2030, that's going to be 31%.
Right.
So it will remain. Here. So we think coal states, heavily dependent coal states, will invest in coal. They will most likely not take advantage of the shifting to lower sources, and they won't need to.
I have just a few seconds, but my concern is that it just effectively shuts down plants. I did want to touch on another issue just very quickly. I had the opportunity earlier this week to have a dinner with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. We met with some officials with Department of Defense. We talked about national security. We talked about global security and the need that we see for that global security, especially in Europe, with regards to the belligerent moves of Russia and our NATO allies, what they face there with natural gas. How are we going to address not just national security but global security when we have such limits put on natural gas?
Hey, if you can make your answer really brief. We have a vote started. My goal was to try to get everybody in prior to. We might be able to do it if we stick to the time. So can you speak briefly to that? And then we're going to...
Well, again, this is a very consistent strategy to support the President's all-of-the-above energy policy. It does not set specific limits on any fuel. It expects all fuels to continue to be operated at significant levels, but it will provide a more efficient energy supply system, and it will reduce the harmful carbon pollution that is impacting
Hopefully we
us.
can work with you on that for the
Thank you.
security of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We move